Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Roslyn Layton, co-founder of China Tech Threat. We study the problems of technology produced by the People's Republic of China and suggest policy solutions to protect the security, privacy, and prosperity of all Americans. I'm honored today to have a panel to discuss the future role of the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security. We actually have 4 prior undersecretaries of this esteemed agency. Joining us today is Cordell Hull of the Trump administration, Eric Hirschhorn of the Obama administration, Mario Mancuso from the George W. Bush administration, and William Reinsch of the William Clinton administration. Today's event is all the more timely because this morning it was reported that a former Department of Defense official, Alan Estevez, will be nominated to lead BIS for the Biden administration. This gentleman has 4 years of expertise in defense technology, supply chain security, and foreign investment. It's likely an ideal background to direct the Bureau, however, perhaps an unusual one. President Biden's appointment indicates that strategic security is going to be a preeminent concern in his administration, and likely that this gentleman will take bold actions with regards to export controls and the entity list. However, we have very little on record from Mr. Estevez himself in speaking about China and other issues, so it remains to be seen. One other, we had as well, he can't join us today, but we recorded some videos prior to this event with Eric Hirschhorn, and he emailed us this morning just to say that he believes Mr. Estevez is a serious and solid person. Now, before we begin our discussion with the panel, I wanted to give a moment to share some of the remarks recorded earlier with Mr. Hirschhorn.
I think the biggest difference is probably outside the agency, which is that when I first worked on export controls at the Commerce Department in the Jimmy Carter administration back in 1980, export controls were not as well known as they are today. And an awful lot of people were violating the rules without even knowing there were rules. Also, the program at that time had about a $38 million budget. It's now over $120 million a year. It had less than 200 employees. It now has about 400. Had almost no enforcement capability. Now has well over 100 sworn enforcement agents. So, in any case, now our audience, you can see our 4 panelists today. So we've had some news this morning, panel. I'd love to get your thoughts, Mario, Bill, on this presumed nominee.
Sure, Roslyn. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Listen, I wish Mr. Estevez luck. I'm sure the Senate will, when he's nominated, the Senate will review his nomination. But I have to say that thus far, just based on paper, it's encouraging that someone of his background seems to be like he will be nominated. Specifically, his experience at the Department of Defense, specifically his policy experience as opposed to traditional compliance experience. Not that the latter is unimportant, but I think the role of the undersecretary, especially in this environment, is fundamentally different, and that he's familiar with the Department of Defense. So every day, 25,000 people show up at the Pentagon doing really important work, in addition, of course, to those who go to the Department of Commerce. But having an Undersecretary of Commerce who knows the security issues, who knows these issues in terms of policy, and who knows offices and where to go in the multiple nodes inside the Department of Defense that bear upon interagency discussions on these issues, I think is hugely important. So while the jury is out, we don't know much about the substantive positions, and the Senate will no doubt probe that. I think it's encouraging because I think the next BIS Undersecretary is going to have to, for the sake of the country and for the sake of the challenges we face, to be able to engage at a deep substantive policy level inside the interagency, and of course, provide on a daily basis purpose, direction, motivation to the many great civil servants at BIS.
Bill, I wanted to get your take as well.
Well, my general rule is if it's somebody I know, it's a good appointment. And in this case, I don't know him, so I can't make any direct comment. I've talked to people who do know him, and they have only complimentary things to say along the lines of what Mario said. So I think he's clearly got the qualifications. I'm sure he'll be fine. I think he has the advantage of not a what's the right word? Extensive public record of commenting on these issues, which will make him more confirmable than other candidates, because it's a position, as we all know, that's not without controversy. So hopefully he'll get through soon without a lot of difficulty. I do have to say I'm disappointed, because I think there was one candidate that was head and shoulders above everybody else, and that was Kevin Wolf. And I think it's embarrassment that the White House chose not to nominate him and went somewhere else. But on the whole, I think Alan will be fine.
Thank you for that. So, Cordell, I want to turn to you. Let's get into the discussion about BIS for our listeners. It's on the front lines for strategic trade control. And thinking about China's ambitions in particular, when we look at our title for today's event, how should BIS evolve to ensure the U.S. leads in critical technologies? Are there, do we need more or different resources to rise to this challenge?
Well, I always default to more resources would be good. I certainly said that to the Hill when I was at BIS, and as a Hill staffer, certainly heard that from every agency I ever talked to. But BIS really does punch above its weight in a lot of ways, and the evolution that I think needs to happen over the next couple of years or next decade or so really is a continuation of the evolution that we've seen over the last few years, where it's a pivot from the traditional mission of non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation, to really being on the front lines of the great power competition. We've seen a lot of efforts with respect to China, of course, and to Russia as well. So I think it needs to continue to evolve that way. We saw a couple of elements during the last administration: increased use of the entity list, picking different targets than had been targeted historically. The military and user rule, I think, was another evolution. I think continuing along that line is going to be necessary. I certainly can't take credit for this, but one of my former colleagues said at one point that he viewed BIS as being akin to what the Treasury's Terrorism and Financial Intelligence Unit was in the early 2000s. And I thought that was a pretty interesting thing to say, and I think there are some similarities there. I'm sure some folks on the call might have some differences that too, but it seemed right. It seemed like an agency that has had a traditional mission. There's been a bit of a shift in the world in the last couple of years that we're pushing BIS towards greater prominence in this role, and I think the Bureau can and will, frankly, continue to evolve with that.
So Mario, let's zero in on a critical technology that's in the news and certainly under the purview of BIS, that being semiconductors. Not long ago, the Nikkei and the Financial Times published a big story on the Chinese state-owned semiconductor manufacturer that's been linked to the Chinese Army, YMTC being this manufacturer. And the recent supply chain report from the White House singled out YMTC, saying it represents a watershed moment in China's semiconductor ambitions. And during a recent markup of the Eagle Act, Representative Pfluger called it out to being added to the entity list. Now, this conversation about what to do about this company has heated up, and we've seen this before with, for example, SMIC and Huawei. What does it signal when we have this kind of discussion?
Well, I think it signals a lot of things, but maybe if I could just take a step back before I answer the question, because it's related, is that I think it's very easy for us to just really be US-centric in our approach, right? So I think we have to start from the premise that, frankly, as much as President Trump changed America, President Xi has changed China even more. And the focus on semiconductors, the focus on industries that can confer advantages or certainly mitigate differentials, power differentials between China and the United States is one of the many things that President Xi has done. Semiconductors is clearly at the top of that list. I think the US government naming particular Chinese semiconductor companies is just evidence that the US government is clearly focused on this, but I think is more adept and facile at identifying these threats, and frankly, more willing to do so publicly. You know, it's not as if the US is we have terrific civil servants in government. We could always have more resources, but we have really terrific capabilities. But for a long time, there's been this, for good reason, an unwillingness perhaps, or perhaps more caution about calling China out on its activities. I think that has changed over the last decade. China started changing dramatically in about 2010, right before the ascension of Xi, really at the tail end of Hu Jintao's tenure in office. But we didn't really start to realize the depth of that change until about 2014. Some would say 2016. So I think this is just evidence of the U.S. showing up in a very important sort of struggle and challenge. And I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. And I think it's laudatory and important that we do it. And again, semiconductors is just one of many industries that we have to start to focus on.
Well, YMTC is hardly the only problem when we look at China and the semiconductor industry. Many other Chinese companies have been called out, for example, CXMT. And it turns out that these companies are depending upon U.S. allies. According to the same White House report, the 3 of the top 5 semiconductor manufacturers in the U.S. Are from the U.S. Applied Materials, Lam Research, and KLA. So, Cordell or Bill, how do you approach the needs of industry versus national security? What should be done today? We talk about we can't really balance these things, but in effect, there is kind of a balancing. What are your thoughts, Bill? Oh, Bill, I apologize. We're going to get you.
Sorry, my fault.
That's okay.
You're always walking a fine line between controlling too little and controlling too much. You control too little and technology leaks and has the consequences we've been talking about. You over control, and what you end up doing is undermining your own domestic industry. And you create incentives in other countries to go their own way and produce their own technologies without relying on U.S. equipment. And China has demonstrated its determination to do the latter. I think Mario's right. A lot of what's changed over the years has been in China more than it has been here. And Xi Jinping has clearly taken the country in a more difficult direction from our point of view. It puts a greater burden on our licensing authorities, but they still end up with having to do a cost-benefit analysis, basically. Of it's easy to say, well, we're going to stop the flow of X or Y or Z or whatever it is, but they have to answer the question: is that going to do any good? And B, what are the consequences for the domestic industry? I mean, the dilemma in the semiconductor sector in particular, at all levels, is that China is simultaneously the biggest threat and the best customer. And it's been very difficult for the companies, I think, to sort out how to deal with that. They see what China's doing. They see what it's trying to develop. They see the competition they face. They don't want to forego the short-term revenue that comes from the sales they're making. And frankly, the government has an interest in how that works out, because that's the revenue that permits more investment in the development of next generation technologies. If we cut that off to too great an extent, we end up crippling our guys more than we're crippling them.
Well, you made a point there about multilateralism and being able to work with other countries, and I would like to share a clip from Eric Hirschhorn, because he mentioned that as well. I think that it's a helpful addition to our conversation.
Always have shied away from the use of the word balancing. I've never thought that balancing made any sense in the area of national security export controls, where it's really national security that we're talking about. You don't balance national security with sales. You can't. But not every chip is a national security matter. Not every sale of something that might conceivably have a military use, no matter how mundane it is a national security matter. Moreover, the important part of this is multilateralism. It doesn't do us much good if 6 countries make something and we're the only ones who are refusing to sell it to a China or to a Russia or what have you. Multilateralism is the only thing that can work. Otherwise, it's the equivalent of damming half a river. And it might make you feel like you did something, but it doesn't have any effect downstream. And the worst The worst situation is one where you're hurting American manufacturers, American exporters, American workers, and not hurting the target at all. I mean, that's the last place you want to find yourself. So multilateralism always has been viewed, and the statute that Congress enacted in 2018 is quite express about this. Multilateralism is essential if we're going to succeed on the sort of restrictive side of the equation. But again, that is not the main part. The main part is the running faster, the doing the job better ourselves part of the equation. We cannot succeed without that.
So, well, I want to turn to you, Cordell. I mean, it's certainly, you know, it's maybe good news that we had an announcement today about a potential nominee. There are still other appointments that need to be made. How critical is it for this person to get in the job and get going? Do you think he can get up and running? What about other positions that might need to be filled?
I think it's important to get politicals into their roles, regardless of the administration. And so I think it's important. But I do want to point out the folks who are there every day, many of whom have been there for decades, know this space well. They're great caretakers. They interact with the secretary. They make sure that they're pushing out her vision of what BIS ought to be doing. So it's important to get politicals in there. I don't think I don't think there's been, at least to my eyes, hasn't been a backslide in much of anything, having the role filled by careers for the last couple of months. But it's important, and there are three Senate confirmed positions in BIS. Obviously, the undersecretary, and then the assistant secretary for export administration, which does most of the policy and the licensing, as well as the assistant secretary for enforcement, which the name obviously says that. So I think hopefully the Senate Banking Committee will move quickly and get Mr. Estevez, assuming the president announces the nomination in short order. But hopefully the Senate Banking Committee will move quickly and fill out the team completely. If I could just pivot back to the last question, though, and I want to endorse a lot of what Bill and what Eric said. The multilateralism and plurilateralism is really, really important, and it's something that the best controls are those that are covering the waterfront. I liked Eric's damming half a river comment, but the run faster piece is important too, and I don't want Mr. Estevez or anybody else in the government to think that export control standing by itself is going to be what pushes us over the line in the great power competition. It simply isn't. It's one leg of the stool in a broad whole of government agency. So I just wanted to pivot back to that to express my agreement with folks over a range of administration and over a range of decades of service at BIS that I agree with a lot of what they said.
If I could say something about timing, I just say I don't think this is particularly unusual. It took a long time for them to select the first undersecretary. When you're really old like I am, you learn all the history. It took a long time. I was nominated, I think, 11 months after the administration took office. Eric, I think it took a long time to get him there. My successor, in contrast, was nominated really, 1 month into the George W. Bush administration. So it's variable, and I think it doesn't have much to do with policy. It has more to do with sorting out the various priorities and finding the right person. This is July. It's not, February would have been better. April would have been better, but this is not the end of the world that it's July. I think the real problem then comes up of how long it's going to take Congress. There was a thing in the Post today about the growing gap in this administration between nominations and confirmations, and the process is dragging. It began in the Trump administration. It's not entirely a partisan thing, but the party that is in the minority has insisted on slow rolling virtually every one of these things and submitting them all to cloture votes. And the result is, you do 1 or 2 a day, and as a result, there's a backlog, and that's what worries me. If they don't, I didn't face those problems. It still took 6 months from the time I was nominated to the time I was confirmed, thanks to some Senate holds. If that happens again, then you get into some serious issues. If somebody's hanging out there twisting in the wind for 6, 8, 10 months. I mean, the Trump administration did not have an assistant secretary for enforcement the entire time. They nominated somebody, and he was never confirmed. He was never taken up. I think we want to avoid that happening.
So, Mario, assuming that this person is confirmed and can get into the job, what would be, the 2 or 3 things that he would need to do right away or to get going on?
Well, actually, just as an incremental point, I think one of the things by the way, I endorse everything that the folks said about kind of having both a denial strategy, which export controls is clearly an important part of, but having an affirmative strategy where we're innovating and leading the world. But one of the first things I think would do is engaging the interagency on these policy questions, making sure that all of the capability that is organic and resident in the Department of Commerce that relates not just to export controls, but to strategic technologies, that the commerce perspective, operational perspective at the micro enterprise level is actually pushed into the interagency, and that's folded into the discussions. I think that's critical. The multilateralism point is an really important point, but multilateralism is multilateral action. That's a technique, and multilateral action could be a race to the bottom or a race to the top. And I actually think the semiconductor industry is a good example because there are many terrific and globally important, significant semiconductor companies located, within the geographies of U.S. allies. And so there, I think multilateralism, one opportunity an undersecretary might have is to reach out to like-minded countries and make the point that if we're going to regulate, on the logic that you can't half dam a river, how do we bring standards higher in light of the collective threat, free liberal societies face on some of these technologies? So in terms of actions, I think engaging the interagency, I do think filling out the team at BIS, the political team that complements the great work done by very capable civil servants. I think diplomacy, small d, working, of course, in coordination with our State Department and the NSC, working with U.S. allies. But I think this is really, I think this is a generational challenge. I mean, if the U.S.-China competition is going to be the defining feature of the international system, the tech competition is a core feature of that competition. And I think the BIS Undersecretary has a unique role to play.
So we're going to open up our discussion to some other issues and check for any audience questions. But before we do that, I'm going to go back to Eric and a video and share another point he made about BIS.
I worry about the degree to which the West relies on one. I worry about the degree to which the West relies on one manufacturer that's in Taiwan. I was thinking about it last night, and I'm wondering if chips are the new petroleum and Taiwan is the new Persian Gulf. Is that a place where, is it? We have to figure out whether we make it public or not. We as a country have to figure out what we are going to do if the Chinese make a military move against Taiwan. I don't think they're going to do it, but we have to be prepared for the possibility that they might. Our interest in Taiwan, perhaps as a country or as a part of a country, is one thing, but our interest in the supply of chips, like our interest in the supply of oil, is something that can't be sneezed at.
So, that's definitely an important point, and also sort of goes directly to, this view about BIS and its critical role in security. I know that we've talked about semiconductors. Any other strategic issues that you want to put on the table? Cordell.
Sure. I think the continued evolution of the ICTS supply chain executive order, I think that's going to be a critical piece of what BIS and really much of a lot of the Department of Commerce will be doing over the next couple of months and years. I think along with semiconductors, that's going to be a big piece of their work.
Yeah. Mario, you have a thought?
Yeah, no. To that, I think that's an excellent point. To that, I would add the recent executive order directing the Interagency and the Commerce Department specifically to come up with recommendations around data security. The data security of Americans and former government officials, really important. So more attention on protecting how technology can be a vector of risk to U.S. person data and how to protect them. Very important.
Absolutely. Well, we care a lot about that at China Tech Threat. Bill, I want to ask you, are we expecting too much of export controls? One view is that, maybe Biden administration and Congress don't understand the limits. Perhaps that there are other instruments that should be in play, and are we relying on this too much, or maybe not enough?
Well, I think Congress doesn't understand. Easy for me to say since I'm not being nominated for anything, and don't have to appear. But I think they've lost expertise in this area. Sadly, there used to be a number of members of Congress who understood it for various reasons, often because they had constituents that cared about it. But a lot of that has dissipated through retirements and defeats and things like that. But I think in my conversations with the administration, I think they understand it. I think they get it, and I think they also have a pretty good awareness of the limitations of it. I mean, the way that I've always explained it is, if your goal is to make sure that your adversary gets none of whatever it is you're trying to keep, you're doomed, because the system simply has too many holes and there's too many alternatives. If, however, your goal is to make sure that your adversary only gets 1/3 of what he needs and takes 10 years instead of 5 years to get them, and they all cost 5 times as much, those are attainable goals, and they're realistic goals. And I think that BIS over the years has been good at setting attainable goals for them. And I think this administration has a good understanding of the limitations of what they can do. The challenge for all of them is enforcement in a digital environment. I mean, when I was doing this in the 90s, it was which was sort of the beginning of the internet. This was simple. Most exports that mattered were physical, and if you were nervous, you stop them at the border and inspect them. And you can evolve a pre-license, post-license inspection system, which they still have, to go out and look at them. I can tell you funny stories about that. In an era of digital commerce, stuff is exported over the internet. It's exported digitally. It's much harder to enforce. And I think that puts an extra burden, particularly on BIS, to try to figure out a way to do that, because in my experience, there is a relatively small group of people who attempt to make a living, and a good one, basically stealing technology and selling it to bad guys, and they get a premium for doing that. And we need to always be vigilant to try to track that down. I think over the last 20 years, companies have begun to do a better job of compliance on their own, and have become more sensitive to the challenges they face and the compliance duties they've got. It's not perfect, and I think we probably all three of us would agree that if there's a weak link in that chain, it's probably universities and academic institutions that I think historically have been the most reluctant to take on significant compliance duties, and have been and had the most difficulty implementing them when they've attempted to do it. So there's a lot of challenges in that area that remain. As again, I think, to Biden's credit, I think they get all that, but these are partly management issues, and they really need somebody at BIS, not only as the undersecretary, but in the enforcement slot, to really get a grip on this and pursue, I think, a more aggressive program, both of enforcement, but also of working with industry to improve their compliance records.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Mario or Cordell? Anything you would care to add?
Sure. I mean, my conversations with folks in the administration have been similar to Bill's. I think they have a very nuanced understanding of export controls and the limitation of export controls. Money and visas and others are a big part of having this competition. So my takeaway from conversations with folks in the administration is similar to Bill's, that they get it. Congress has been very active on export controls over the last couple of years, having been on the Hill and in the departments. Every time the National Defense Authorization Bill comes around every year, there are a lot of very prescriptive items for BIS. I suspect this year will be no different, and we've already seen that in some of the China bills floating around the Hill. So to Bill's point about the loss from members, we've had a number of staffers leave the Hill in recent years who had deep export controls experience. Now there are still folks up there who have a lot and are quite good at it, but it is something that they're very active about, and I think will continue to be active about. But it's I hope folks who are watching this and who are thinking about these issues really take away, and I think all four of us have said this in some form or another. Export controls is just one stick on the bundle of what we're able to do as a government with respect to these very hard issues. And so the idea that this is some panacea that will solve all our problems, none of us has endorsed that, and I hope folks can back away from that idea just a little bit.
I have nothing to add. It was well said by Cordell and Bill.
Great. Well, this next head of BIS will go before the Senate Banking Committee, as you described. And with that in mind, what advice would you give to this person, going in front of the Senate? And, he, from what we can see, not so much publicly that he's written, or we don't have so many videos of him necessarily. I think he's testified before. But what advice would you give to this person? And if you were yourself sitting on the Senate Banking Committee, what question would you like to ask? I'm going to start with you, Bill.
My advice to nominees is always the same: grovel. The best way to get through a confirmation hearing is grovel, agree with everything, make as few commitments as possible, and move on. And the ones that follow that advice have done fairly well, and I think Alan should. I mean, he's going to be asked a number of difficult questions, and people will try to trap him into making commitments. And if you watch the nomination process, look at Catherine Tai, for example, who was able to avoid making any substantive commitments at all in her confirmation hearing and was confirmed unanimously. So it is possible, but this is a controversial area. If I were asking the questions, I think I'd probably ask a different question than some of my colleagues. I'd ask him, particularly given his background, whether he's really prepared and understands the need for working directly with industry and the creators, designers, and manufacturers of the technology that is being controlled, because they're the front line of enforcement. They're the front line of compliance. You can have 100 agents, you can have 300 agents, and you're still going to be deficient if the companies are not doing the job that they're supposed to do, if they're not doing due diligence. And I would want to get a sense from him that he understands and appreciates that and is prepared to have a constructive working relationship with them.
That's a great question. Mario, what about you?
So in addition to everything else I think we've spoken about, I'd have a corollary to Bill's question, which I think is an excellent question, which is, can the next undersecretary reach out to industry and not just hear their perspectives about threats and risks and what they're seeing, but be able to, just like the Treasury Department in an analogous way has great insight into the markets, the macro financial markets. U.S. industry has great insight into actually what's happening on the ground operationally at the enterprise level. That's a source of soft intelligence. And, there are lots of think tanks, lots of really smart people here in town that can talk about these issues, but also adding the micro enterprise perspective, the perspective of industry, what they're seeing, collecting that, and be able to pipe that back into the interagency, in addition to having, thoughtful and open-minded views about, national security. I think that's critical. So I endorse Bill's question. I would add a corollary to that. I wish the next undersecretary great luck.
Cordell, what about you?
I think Bill and Mario's questions were great ones. And again, former Hill staffer, I've always written questions with the intent to make them closed-ended yes/no questions. But I would want to ask a question that I think would potentially allow the nominee to filibuster a little bit. But it's something that I think the Hill has expressed a lot of interest in, and something that I think is quite important. But I'd want to hear what the nominee's plan is to move forward with, continuing to move forward with potentially controlling emerging technologies and moving forward foundational technologies. That's something that ECRA required the Bureau to do, to lead an interagency effort to do that. So I would want to hear, particularly given, assuming it is Mr. Estevez, his time at the Department of Defense, how he would fuse his Defense Department experience with Commerce's legislative mandate to move these things forward. So I would like him to expand on that, and hopefully, if he took a while, the chairman would.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
Mario said something important that prompted something that I've worked on in the past that I think it would be useful to go back to, and that is that I think he's right that companies are often recipients of lots of information that would be useful to the government. The British and the Germans do this much more effectively than we do, in that they try to construct a partnership relationship with companies that are making things that are subject to controls at the high end. The example I've used, and I spent a good bit of time in a previous job in the private sector trying to persuade first the George W. Bush administration and then the Obama administration to do something about this, and they never really got into it for reasons I'll explain. But companies get a lot of solicitations, they get a lot of requests, they get a lot of inquiries about stuff that people want to buy. And that's information that would be enormously useful to the United States government if they could see it. And companies often will just, if they know they can't sell an item to that the person making that inquiry because of who it is or where it's from, what country the person's from, they often just throw it away. They just delete it. And I think the U.S. government would be enormously benefit from having, sort of a two-way flow of intelligence of what the companies are learning, and we approached the U.S. government about that on several occasions, and the answer we consistently got was one, well, we're already doing that, which I think is by and large not true, but that's what they said. But the other problem we ran into was that on the company side, is if you approach them about that, the first thing they will say if the government approaches them about that is, well, let me talk to my general counsel. And Mario may want to comment on this. The first thing the general counsel will say is, get a non-prosecution agreement with the Justice Department before you say anything. And they're not going to be able to do that. And so the dialogue kind of stops there. In this country, we have a much more adversarial relationship between the private sector and the government in issues like this that I think has impeded cooperation. I think Mario is right. We could do more of that very constructively, and having an undersecretary that thought that was important and wanted to go down that road, I think would be a useful thing.
Well, thank you for that. While we've been talking, we've had some audience questions roll in. So I'm going to read you the audience question, one of them. So how should we think about individual company sanctions versus holistic solutions like controls on foundational technology? Mario, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure, I'll start. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. I think on some of the foundational technologies, they're just hard. It would be hard to have a sector-wide solution that would, achieve the security objective you want to achieve without actually killing everything else that we care about. And so I think these holistic solutions, I think conceptually are very attractive, and there may be cases where they make sense. I just think on some of the foundational technologies, think, for example, artificial intelligence, we, the United States, on AI in particular, but it's analogous to other industries. Well, we get a lot as well as create a lot. And so holistic solutions, I think, would break that symbiosis, and I don't necessarily think that's holistic solutions will work wholesale in the emerging or foundational technology space, which are like terms of art. But I am an emotional and intellectual supporter of the premise of the question, that there are instances, maybe they don't relate to foundational technologies, that there are instances where the U.S. government needs to kind of, not play whack-a-mole, and maybe do something broader.
We tried the holistic solution, if you use that term, during the Cold War, because the operating assumption for export controls then was anything that was exported to the Soviet Union would end up in the hands of the Soviet Army. So you had to make a fairly simple decision. You want them to have it or not, because you made the adverse assumption that no matter what it was, it would end up in the Army's hands. During the Clinton administration, post-Cold War, we really switched to an end-user-based model, which is, to be fair about it, is kind of a whack-a-mole approach, which is you look at these things case by case and you make judgments that it's okay to export X to end user Y because end user Y is deemed reliable and safe, is going to use it for the purposes that are authorized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not okay to send the same item to somebody else in the same country because you have questions about end user Z's intentions. That's a lot harder to do. And it inevitably produces some difficulties. But I think that's kind of the system we've got. And in a globalized world, it's kind of the system that we're stuck with. I'm not sure we can do better. I think on foundational in particular, I mean, Cordell, who's had to live with this for the last couple of years, may have a comment, but nobody has ever given me identified a foundational technology other than semiconductors. And if you've got one, I'd like to hear about it. I mean, I think you can make a persuasive case that semiconductors are a foundational technology. On the other hand, if you start talking about controlling foundational technologies holistically, what you're talking about there is controlling semiconductors that have been previously released and are not controlled. So you're closing the barn door long after all the cattle have left, which I think is just a tremendously self-defeating and counterproductive policy. You didn't ask about emerging. Maybe that'll be in a later question, so I won't get into that. But I don't think that I agree with Mario. I don't think that a holistic approach is the right one for the present day.
I think that, I think going back to this view was, I think shared by some in Congress, and we've talked about it as well on this call, that, let's say even the last administration perhaps placed some 300 Chinese companies on the entity list, but that still barely scratches the surface of all the military-linked companies in China. So, it's a fair question to say, we need to have a holistic solution in the sense that, well, we know that there are certain key systematic levels of integration, and this attempt to, pursue the tail and then get them all, it's just not scalable. But again, this is, I think, one of the debates at the fore. Cordell, do you have anything to say on this? Because you were involved in this most recently.
I was, and Bill, Bill hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's a lot of these. First of all, it's very hard to define what a foundational technology is, and I think if those who've read the advance notice of proposed rulemaking we put out about this time last summer, it sort of gets at that, and it says to interested stakeholders, tell us what you think a foundational technology is. That was a different approach than the Bureau took with respect to emerging technologies, where it listed 14 broad categories and said, here's what we're thinking about, let us know. And that difference was intentional, but it's very, very difficult. And to Bill's point about semiconductors, I mean, that's one that pops into a lot of people's minds. But again, to Bill's point, a lot of the stuff has been decontrolled over the years. And so if we're really trying to play catch up, that's going to be a challenge. On the point of sort of sectoral or non-end user based controls, I mean, that's a very appealing solution because it's just simple. You can't send X to Y country. Done, easy, finished. But I think it's something you said earlier in the discussion, Roslyn, that China is the biggest market and it's the biggest threat. And so that is a challenge. And to weave some of the number of these questions and answers together, I mean, that will impact the run faster piece of this. So it's very, you know, the end user based controls are not ideal. I think they're very hard, and in a lot of places you're playing catch up. Hopefully the military end user rule, now that it's been in effect for about a year or so, hopefully that will grab some more of it. The department has put out a list that identifies companies the government knows to be Chinese, Russian, Venezuelan, or Burmese end users, military end users. But that, you know, the onus is on the exporter to find that as well. Hopefully that will continue to grab things that are going to end users we don't like, who are not on the entity list. But it's a huge challenge.
So I want to give a moment for us to play a clip from Eric, because he actually had something to say on this topic. So let's roll the tape.
I think the best piece of advice I got before my confirmation hearing was, if you're talking more than 20% of the time, there's a problem. So that's the first piece of advice I would give. The second piece of advice I would give, assuming it's someone who hasn't been at BIS before, is to take some refuge in the fact that you're not there yet. You may know what's in the newspapers, you may know what's in, you know, the blogs, but you don't know what's going on inside. And even when I was in private practice and I occasionally would criticize what Commerce or another agency was doing, I always understood that I didn't have access to the intelligence they had. I didn't have access to all the issues that they were dealing with. So a nominee can take refuge in that and say, look, I'm not there yet, Senator. I'd be happy to stay in touch with you once I'm there. From my distant vantage point, this is what I sense, but I'm not going to commit to anything until I'm there. It makes perfect sense. What would I ask? I don't know. I'd ask the kind of questions you're asking, which is, what do you see as the role of export controls in dealing with China? If you have a view of it, what's your understanding of the threat from China? And questions like that. Obviously, China is going to be very much in the forefront of the confirmation hearings for the undersecretary and the assistant secretaries when they come before the Senate.
So while that was playing, we had a question come in from the Department of Defense, representative from there, who asked, what role, if any, can BIS play in curtailing the export and sharing of sensitive data about Americans, such as detailed location tracking on national security professionals? I'm going to start with you, Mario.
So I think this is I think this is a hugely important issue. I think this is truly one of those issues that multiple agencies inside the government are going to work on. But right now, there's an executive order that has now tasked, President Biden has issued an executive order that has tasked the Department of Commerce to come up with recommendations. Listen, frankly, any American should know that their data is protected, right? That is something that I would say that frankly about anyone, but certainly I'm an American, and so this is sort of task one. That is acutely true if you work for our government and you serve our government, and you should know that you can't be manipulated, that your data is private and private to you. I think the Department of Commerce obviously will work through these recommendations and figure out means of doing it. There are, the Department of Commerce could look at, data vulnerabilities that may arise from connected software. There's the ICTS executive order that Cordell alluded to that would give the Department of Commerce a specific regulatory look at certain transactions in the ICTS space that may bear upon data. I'm not sure I know there isn't a single solution to this, but this is an urgent problem. The protection of the data of U.S. persons generally, and obviously U.S. civil servants in particular.
Well, I appreciate that. It is something that we have worked extensively on at China Tech Threat. I mean, if you take China's policy outright, any data collected on a Chinese-made device, whether it's a software, whether it's a Lenovo laptop, a Huawei phone, a base station, what have you, it can, be commandeered by the Chinese government, processed, copied, checked, whatever. And so, this isn't, regardless of whatever regulation the U.S. takes. So there are extensive threats beyond what our regulation can do.
And Roslyn, if I can just add to that, and I
Yes.
and China itself has validated that this is a risk factor. Just days ago, the Chinese Cyber Administration issued a proposed rule that would require Chinese tech companies that collect data on Chinese users to get approval from the Chinese government before listing outside of China. Now, completely unrelated, but my point is that the policy driver for that stated proposal by the Chinese was that they were concerned about their own data. So this is not some esoteric, hard to understand, imaginary risk. It's a real risk, and we see it every day in the papers.
And many of us, some people have experienced it for sure. And I think that has to do with the DOD asking the question because they have concerns about, their soldiers and personnel, as you well explained. So today, we have covered many things. We had the announcement this morning about Alan Estevez potentially being nominated to lead BIS. We've talked extensively about semiconductors, the pros and cons of export controls, the limitations, other areas where we may need to strengthen BIS, the expertise of different government agencies, what they have to bring to the table. We talked about companies of concern like YMTC and CXMT. Talked about U.S. companies that are selling to those Chinese firms like Applied Materials, KLA, and Lam Research. And we've also given some potential advice to the potentially incoming nominee. And we've also shared about changes about BIS, and some have observed, BIS hasn't changed so much, but it's the world around BIS has changed, and maybe that has brought forth, potentially looking at a nominee from a new sector, for example. So I just wanted to turn it back to the panel, whether there were any other points that you wanted to make that you didn't have a chance to, and to give you that opportunity now. So, well, I would also, yes, also to say at China Tech Threat, we have a section on our website called Future of BIS, where we have actually asked some of you, thank you, Bill and Cordell, you've contributed, where you've actually commented on Future of BIS. You can find those documents there, those detailed articles. We have profiles of other people who've been considered for this role. We have a number of articles from the media that have looked at this. We have op-eds collected. So it's a great resource for people who want to learn more about BIS. What are the expectations of the new undersecretary? So please be sure to check that out. I also want to encourage our listeners, if you haven't, to follow us on Twitter at China Tech Threat and sign up for our newsletter. We'd love to keep in touch with you. And we're delighted that today we've had 4 outstanding speakers with us, Eric Hirschhorn, Cordell Hull, Mario Mancuso, and Bill Reinsch, who have shared their thoughts about what we call the most important agency that you've never heard of. But of course, that will not be the case anymore because many people have heard about it. We've had over 200 attendees today and expect more. So I want to thank everyone for your participation, for tuning in, and we will hope to see you again on China Tech Threat. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.